Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham. The story of Ron LeFlore is being retold, bringing the rise and fall story of LeFlore to another generation of people being introduced to the Detroit Tigers legend. Then we'll revisit a conversation with legendary Detroit DJ Carl Craig and learn a little more about his newest residency at Michigan State University. He's exploring the science of music with MSU's Facility for Rare Isotope Beams, or FRIB. But first, the story of retired baseball player Ron LeFlore is one that is worth repeating. LeFlore was a gifted athlete who lived a troubled childhood. His actions eventually landed him in prison when he was only 21 years old. But LeFlore refused to let those mistakes define him. His talent, perseverance, plus a little luck, catapulted him out of prison and onto the Detroit Tigers roster for 6 seasons. Throughout his career, he led the league in stolen bases twice and secured a spot on the 1976 All-Star team. Ron LeFlore's story has been told before. He co-authored his autobiography in 1978. That same year, a movie was made about his life, starring LeVar Burton. Nearly 50 years later, author Adam Henig felt there is still a little bit more of LeFlore's story. In his new book, Baseball's Outcasts, The Story of Ron LeFlore, Henig details the former Tigers' journey from the streets of Detroit to the dugout and LeFlore's life after the major leagues. Henig explores some of the newest details about Ron LeFlore's life with the Metro's Kerry Jr. II. They begin their conversation in the 1950s and 60s Detroit when Ron LeFlore was a child. The city was changing. Businesses and residents were fleeing to the suburbs, which worsened conditions for the families who stayed. Here's their conversation.
What was Ron's upbringing like?
Well, Ron was one of 4 siblings, and they were all boys. 2 of them came from a different relationship. So his mom had had a previous relationship with someone. I don't know if she was ever actually married to him. So this was a blended family. And his parents did their best. His dad, unfortunately, was an alcoholic. He physically abused his kids. He physically abused his wife. They were living check to check. At one point, they're all living essentially in a one-room apartment that's infested with rats. As soon as they go outside, if they were old enough, they would be approached by gangs. And his 2 older brothers joined some pretty harsh street gangs. Drugs, alcohol, gambling, prostitution, it was all there. Ron was really living in the roughest neighborhoods of East Side Detroit. And then there was the constant moving. His first encounter with the juvenile justice system, he had already moved something like 4 or 5 times, so essentially he's moving every 2 or 3 years, which brings instability. His mom did her best, given what she had, but there weren't the types of social services that are available now. If she was being beaten at home, there weren't readily available services that she could go to get help. Whether it be going to a shelter, finding a job that would allow her to be financially solvent on her own. It just didn't exist back then. And so she had to put up with a lot. And Ron's dad got laid off a lot. And so they had to do a lot to make ends meet. There was a day, I don't know how old Ron was, maybe like 7 or 8 years old, when he came home from school and he noticed his mom was home, and he found his mom sleeping with the landlord to help pay the rent. And she told him afterwards, don't tell your dad about this.
So how did those conditions impact him as a child, as he grows up?
Yeah, so Ron was rambunctious. He was looking for attention. He was looking for what is his place in the world. As he's traveling through grade school, going to middle school, and what he finds is that he shines as someone who gets engaged with illegal activities. It starts off as one would expect, with some pretty light petty crimes.
Hmm.
Stealing money, smoking cigarettes, and eventually it leads to stealing liquor, and trying harder drugs. And at one point, he becomes a pimp. And he's essentially fearless. I mean, he just feels numb
Mm.
to doing anything that would be considered the right thing to do. So by this point, he's 15, 16 years old. He's dropped out of school. He has no plans to return. His parents feel as if they don't have control over him anymore. He's had multiple encounters with law enforcement, and eventually, he gets caught stealing. The police are able to track him because he's already been in the system, and he goes to like a juvenile detention center. And unfortunately, he's there long enough where his younger brother Gerald, arrives as well. So
Mm.
as he's cycling out,
Right.
Ron,
Right.
his younger brother's cycling in, and that was very sobering for Ron. And for a moment, he tries to turn his life around. He even gets a job working side by side with his dad, at Detroit Diesel. But after a couple of weeks, he's like, "This is horrible.
Mm.
Like, why am I going to do this? Bust my butt when I'm making 1/10 of what I can make in one day selling heroin."
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty clear his father was not a positive influence on his life. Was there anyone else who tried to have a more positive influence on Ron?
If there was one person in Ron's life when he was, let's see, 11, 10, 11, 12 years old, who could easily become his role model and keep him away from the streets, it was his older half brother, Harry. Harry was an accomplished boxer. He started out in the recreation league, and coaches noticed he had a lot of potential. He eventually gets a scholarship to San Jose State University. And this is in the 1950s when boxing was a sanctioned sport at the NCAA level. And Harry was their golden boxer. I mean, he just knocked everyone out. And eventually, he gets a manager who says, "Listen, I'll take you to the pros. First, go to the Olympics," which he does. He doesn't get a medal, but it definitely opens a lot of doors to him. Ultimately, he would like to become a police officer, but during his professional boxing career, he gets off to a great start, but unfortunately, it was either in his fifth or sixth bout, he gets killed in the ring, and it was traumatic, obviously, for his family, especially his mom, and notably for Ron.
Where does that ultimately lead Ron?
Ron does get involved in the drug trade, and him and a group of peers decide to rob a bar that they know has a lot of cash on hand. And they were successful in terms of getting away with the money, but they made some regrettable mistakes as they were going back to their residence, and they got caught. And Ron was sentenced 5 to 15 years for armed robbery, and he was what was he? He was 20 years old, 21 years old. Deep down, like so many people in his situation, growing up in Detroit, or in any major city at that time, poor, black, and just not having any sort of motivation to turn his life around. He had very little hope, and it was in solitary confinement, where he begins thinking to himself, I've got basically two choices. I can either continue in this direction, or I can try to turn my life around.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET Detroit Public Radio. I'm Kerry Jr. II. My guest is author Adam Henig. He wrote the book Baseball's Outcasts, the story of Ron LeFlore. And Ron LeFlore is a former Tigers player. He played for them in the 1970s after spending time in prison. All right. Now, prison is where Ron turned his life around, but it's also where he discovers baseball. How did that happen?
Yeah, so Ron had really never played any sort of organized baseball before. And so when he got to prison, as I mentioned, he was in solitary confinement. And Ron's a schemer. So he's trying to figure out, well, what's the quickest way for me to get out of here? And at first it's just to get a job and then get a job in the kitchen and then get a GED. And then he noticed that athletes who played on in the recreational leagues, whether it was football, baseball, basketball, all got special privileges, and so he wanted to be a part of that. And he first tries out softball, and he just doesn't like it. He doesn't like the coach. He doesn't like the players. And then he tries out for baseball, and it just seemed like a natural connection for him. Ron was athletic. He was athletic well before he was in prison, but in prison he's able to show off his skills, and he has incredible speed. I mean, speed of that of an Olympian. And his manager happens to be a friend of a bar owner who is very close with, at that time, the Detroit Tigers manager, who was Billy Martin. And the manager himself was kind of a washed out athlete, but he recognized Ron's talent. And he's like, this guy is good.
So what was his competition like in prison? Did he have competition, or were they just mid or average players? So he was just able to dominate every game.
Prison was quite large, and so they did have other prison teams that he would compete against, and then they would have like an all-star team, right? So the best players within the prison would compete against one another, but they would also bring in teams from the outside. So there were some local colleges that would come. In fact,
Ah,
one of them featured a pitcher who eventually played for the Detroit Tigers, and he remembered Ron playing in for Southern for the state prison of Southern Michigan. That's how good Ron was, and so Ron is the beneficiary of having a warden who was very forward thinking. And this warden believed in recidivism. He believed in terms of that if you have a prisoner who has things to look forward to, has things to keep him occupied, he's going to behave well and he's going to find success in the outside. And at that time, believe it or not, it was a very unusual philosophy. And so this warden instituted so many programs that would help prisoners become successful outside of prison, and of course, eventually get paroled and so forth. And one of those programs was this 48-hour furlough pass. And so if you showed constant and you proved yourself good behavior, and you did an assortment of other things, you would be allowed to leave the facility for 48 hours. You would be released to someone, and then they would have to bring you back within 2 days.
mm.
And so Ron used his furlough pass to go to a tryout at Tiger Stadium. And that's where he was able to showcase his skills.
Is that common for professional baseball teams to recruit players from prison?
No.
Okay.
The only difference between now and then, so this is something that I found very interesting, is I would find advertisements
Hmm.
in the Detroit Free Press newspaper, for example, in the
Mm-hmm.
sports section for tryouts for baseball players who are on high school or college teams. Come try out. And so the Tigers would actually hold an open tryout, which no Major League Baseball team would do in
Today.
2026.
Yeah.
So having a tryout from someone who wasn't being specifically recruited wasn't totally unusual in that instance. But obviously, someone from prison, that was highly unusual. And it was a bit concerning to certain members of the front office. Billy Martin was Billy Martin. He was a bit of a renegade. And it was because of him he got that tryout. And Ron definitely met the challenge. I mean, he
Hmm.
did it. He had a memorable tryout that anyone who was there still remembers to this day, as I was able to listen when I interviewed them. And he did obviously well enough that he was invited for a follow up tryout, and that's when the Tigers decided to sign him.
Ron goes on to have a pretty successful career while he's a Tiger during the 70s. He banked in at least like a 260 average in his time in Detroit, and he had years where he was batting at 300. He had a pretty decent career now.
Just to make it to the major leagues
Right.
is next to impossible. To make it from where Ron was coming from, it's not a 1 in a million chance. It's a 1 in a billion chance. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's incredible how difficult it is. First of all, just to get signed to a team that's actually affiliated with a Major League Baseball club,
Mm-hmm.
and then to get out of a single A and make it up to double A, triple A, and then, and again, this is where luck is on Ron's side, to have the person who plays your position for the Detroit Tigers get injured.
Right.
And so the team brings him up. And his first game, he's not hanging out in the dugout, slowly acclimating. He's literally the first person, because they're a visiting team, and he's a leadoff, to hit. And so he has no time to just kind of take it all in. He is literally thrown out there.
Mm.
And it takes him about a season and a half to start sizzling. And once he does, Ron becomes one of the most feared hitters in the league. Ron is so fast that pitchers would often quip that when Ron hits a single, it's a double. Or if he hits a double, it's a triple, because they know he's going to steal, and he's always, well, I shouldn't say always, but oftentimes very successful. Ron complained that if he had played for a better team, his numbers would be even more impressive. And it's possible that he may have even made it to Cooperstown, because there were so many times where Ron would be on base and no one would be able to get him home. Or they would strike out, and so the stolen base wouldn't count, So there is something to be said about that. But Ron, from 1976 to I would say 80, his numbers were not just great. I mean, they were not just good, but they were great.
Now, in 76, he had a pretty almost historic run, but an impressive run of hits through that season. Is that seen or widely credited as like his best career season?
Well, he certainly gets recognized for it. He was selected as a starter for the All-Star game. 1978 was a great year for him as well. Really, those final 4 seasons with the Tigers, 76 through 79, he was their best hitter. I mean, he was just flat out their best offensive weapon. And then they trade him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the fallout begins. Ron was not anticipating that whatsoever, despite the fact that he had a very sour relationship with the then manager Sparky Anderson, who did not like Ron whatsoever. And
Well, why is that? What created this tension, this rift?
Ron, for the previous seasons before Sparky arrived, he pretty much did whatever he wanted in terms of, he would go to practice one day, wouldn't go another day. He was supposed to show up 3 hours before a home game. He wouldn't get there until 30 minutes before. And so Ron was not used to having someone micromanage his day-to-day duties. And of course, Ron naively felt he was invincible. And for a time he was. I mean, after that movie came out, which aired on CBS. It was a made-for-television movie starring LeVar Burton, who had just finished Roots. Ron was not just a baseball player. I mean, he became a celebrity. He was very well known. He had a best-selling book. He was he had a movie that was based on his life.
It's called 1 in a Million, right? 1 in a Million.
Called 1 in a Million, yes. And he would be at Studio 54. He would be found backstage hanging out with Rod Stewart. But now his drug use picked up. He had a lot more money. There was a lot more partying, and there was no accountability. And then when Sparky was the manager, things started to go downhill for him.
Coming up, Carey Jr. II and author Adam Henig wrap up Ron LeFlore's journey as a player and explain why the story is still relevant today. You all stay right there. We'll be right back. This is The Metro. This is The Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham. Former Detroit Tiger Ron LeFlore went through many obstacles growing up in Detroit during a time of struggle in the city. Despite his upbringing, he became an all-star in the major leagues. But old habits he developed in his younger life continue to plague him into adulthood. Adam Henig details LeFlore's complex life in his new book, Baseball's Outcasts, the story of Ron LeFlore. Just before the break, Adam shared how LeFlore's struggles from his childhood began to catch up with him as a major league player. Let's hop back into that conversation.
Ron ended his career in Chicago on a really bad note. No one from Major League Baseball wanted to have anything to do with him. He had burned so many bridges, and he was very, very deep into drugs. And so when I would talk to him about this period, I mean, he doesn't even remember portions of it because he was just so engaged in cocaine and alcohol, and he just wasn't available to his family and able to make a living. Once he seeks treatment, he realizes how limited his opportunities are. And so he takes whatever he can, whether it's being an umpire for a high school baseball game, whether it's being a security guard, whether it's being a sky cap at a local airport. Whatever came his way, he would take. And really the late 80s, early 90s is the rise of the baseball card and memorabilia shows. And so Ron would go to go to hotels, convention centers, and it would all be paid for. And plus he would receive an appearance fee for signing autographs for fans. And so this is how he made his living. But Ron really wanted to get back into Major League Baseball. So he ended up finding work as a manager for these unaffiliated minor league baseball clubs. And Ron just wasn't cut out to be a manager. And so it ended up, it just didn't end up to turn into anything because his ultimate goal was to get back into the major leagues.
So I want to get a sense of your purpose behind this book. Why did you choose to tell Ron's story?
Well, it actually started when I was a kid. I was a big sports fan, and my mom, being the teacher that she was, always encouraged me to read books, and I've wanted to read books about baseball players. And so when I was about 8, 9, or 10 years old, we were at the library, and she found this book that I thought would be interesting. And it was a children's book based on Ron's autobiography. It was called From Prison to the Major Leagues. And I devoured it. It was really interesting. I didn't know anything about Ron prior. I was too young to have seen him actually play when he was on the Tigers. But the story always stuck with me. And after finishing my last book, I was trying to think of a subject that I would want to write about. And one day it just kind of popped in my mind. I was just thinking, what had happened to Ron LeFlore? And I had noticed a lot had happened to Ron LeFlore, especially since his autobiography had come out during the peak of his playing days. And I thought, this is going to be a really good story. And then I find out that Ron is still alive. And so I make a connection with someone who had recently interviewed him, and I asked if he would serve as the go-between to see if Ron would be interested in being interviewed. And sure enough, Ron was, and we talked. And for the first couple of minutes, I was very nervous because I was just thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I'm talking to Ron LeFlore. But I settled in, and he and I spoke for dozens of times over the last 5 years. And it helped me be able to tell his story.
This story, Ron's story, is a pretty familiar tale for people who were Tigers fans at that time. Ron has told his own story in an autobiography. There was a movie, One in a Million, made about his life, like you described. Why did you believe your book could add more to this story?
Well, that's a good question. So when his book and then the movie that is based on the book,
Mm-hmm.
it ends in 1976, which was when Ron was selected to be a starter in the All Star game, and he of course was in the outfield for the American League. But there's so much more to Ron's story that occurs after those years.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing too I noticed is that his book is very narrow in terms of the scope.
Mm-hmm.
For example, he doesn't really he talks about his childhood a lot, but he doesn't talk about the ramifications of the neighborhood that he lives in. Meaning, his parents, like so many other um, young people during the pre and post World War II days, they came from the Jim Crow South, and so they came for, of course, economic opportunity and mobility. And um, unbeknownst to his parents and hundreds of thousands of other future Detroiters, they didn't know what they were walking into. Was life better for them? Perhaps, but they were, of course, relegated to certain neighborhoods which had limited services. It had, poor housing, it had poor educational services, um, high crime rates, and whenever the economy took a nosedive, which it did in the years after World War II, they were the first to feel it. And so Ron's parents really struggled in their transition from the South to Detroit. And that had a huge impact. And so I found out there were a lot of things that Ron didn't mention, some of which intentionally, because he was at the time, as he explained to me, was embarrassed about it, or um, didn't want his mom, who was and his dad, who was still around, I think, to think less of him for it. So there was that aspect, and then there were just things that he just hadn't mentioned. He didn't mention that he himself was involved in the 1967 riots in Detroit.
Mm.
He was part of the looting. So my job was to provide context,
Mm.
and I felt that Ron's story was so unique. How many people can come from prison and become professional athletes? And why did he end up in prison? How did he get there? And so I wanted to answer those questions because I felt like his autobiography hadn't. And plus, of course, the autobiography had come out almost 50 years ago. So
Mhm.
it's a bit dated.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. My guest is author Adam Henig, and we are discussing his new book, Baseball's Outcast, The Story of Ron LeFlore. Ron LeFlore, of course, played for the Detroit Tigers in the 1970s after spending time in prison. Adam, as you started having conversations with Ron and unearthing some of these more unflattering details of his past, how did he take that?
Unlike, I think, a lot of professional athletes, Ron is very upfront
Hmm.
about his life.
Hmm.
I think it's partly his personality. He is an extrovert. He is a talker. Um, and I also think, too, Ron has spent more than half his life telling this story
Hmm.
because it's always the first question from the moment that he signs with the Tigers in 1973, while he just had been released from prison. It is the first question every reporter asks him. Tell me about your time in prison. How did you get there? What was it like? It was something that unfortunately he could never shake. Even 5 years into the league, he's still being, relegated to that ex-con label. And that's ultimately what he's known for is being this athlete who came of age inside the walls of a maximum security prison. And so I think Ron, coupled with that, he's just very comfortable, at least at this day and age, of talking about his past. I also think too that Ron felt a bit forgotten and underappreciated, and especially by the Detroit Tigers. And they had some justification for that. Ron had unfortunately brought some bad publicity to them because of the choices that he made. But nevertheless, Ron, I think, wanted to tell his story. I think he deserves to have a legacy, good or bad. He deserves to be remembered, and that's what I tried to capture.
Do you think that since time has passed, since Ron lived this life, since he wrote the initial story in his autobiography, that that alone may change the way we look back on his story?
Yeah. I think it's a very good point. Do we look at the world differently in 2026 than we did during the height of his playing days, which was the late 1970s? And most certainly we do. I believe that Ron, the issues that came up when Ron was playing, whether it was in the minors or in the majors, there wasn't, I think, like almost an acceptable. It was acceptable that he was able to turn his life around. I mean, that's always been the American dream, right? Being able to pull yourself up from his bootstraps, which he literally did. I mean, if there's ever an example of that, it's definitely him. But in terms of talking about race, I do know that in the original draft of his autobiography, which I was unfortunately unable to find, he did tell me that it had been edited, and I don't know specifically about what, but what I do know is that the Tigers, for I think obvious reasons, probably played down any mention of racism. And that I believe is true, considering that the Detroit Tigers were the second to last team to integrate once Jackie Robinson came to the Dodgers. So this is an organization at that period that had a history of treating people of color lesser than of course they should have been. So I do think that something of that issue certainly was not going to be covered in 1978, which is when the book was published.
Adam, you spent a lot of time with Ron to write this book. Any takeaways for you?
Well, I think what I found most interesting is when he was behind bars and the opportunities that he was given. It requires a lot of funding from the state or from the counties or from the federal government. It requires a certain different set of beliefs in terms of how we treat people who have been who have been convicted and are behind bars. When you treat people as people and not as animals, and when you give them something to hope for, it's amazing how often they can redirect their behavior and channel it into something good. And Ron's a great example of that. And there are a lot of other people who are too. But if you don't provide that atmosphere, that environment, those opportunities, it is just going to be a vicious cycle.
Adam Henig is an author whose new book, Baseball's Outcasts, The Story of Ron LeFlore, details the former Tigers' journey from the streets of Detroit to the major leagues. Coming up, science and sound collide in a new project by electronic music pioneer Carl Craig. He tells us about the idea behind his new artist residency at Michigan State University. Next on The Metro, we'll be right back.